Hello, my name is Melanie Mitchell. I'm going to be talking about efforts to get machines in AI systems to abstract and make analogies. So many of you are probably familiar with the Dartmouth Summer Research Project. This was a workshop proposed in 1955 and held in 1956 by some of the pioneers of AI, and many people trace this workshop, trace the origins of the field back to this workshop. The idea here was they were going to spend a summer thinking about how to make machines use language, form abstractions and concepts, and solve kinds of problems now reserved for humans and improve themselves. Well, that's a big order, and of course, all of these problems still remain open to this day, many decades later. But none are more open than this idea of being able to make machines form abstractions and concepts. And as it turns out, that this lack of ability in machines to reason abstractly, to form abstract concepts, limits the ability of machine learning programs to transfer what they have learned to novel situations. And I'll describe that in more detail in just a minute. So deep neural networks, of course, have revolutionized the field of AI, enabling many applications such as object recognition. The ImageNet object recognition competition was held for several years. And the idea here was there's over 1 million images that have been labeled by humans. Machines would compete on this challenge. This is the error rate of the machine, so lower is better. In 2010, the best system, which was actually based on support vector machines, not deep neural networks, got over 25% error. And then gradual improvement the next year. But the next year, with this supervision program, the error rate fell dramatically. And of course, this is due to the advent of deep neural networks, which have over the years gotten deeper and deeper, more and more layers. And now these machines, at least on the some aspects of the ImageNet challenge, are below what has been estimated for human performance. This, of course, doesn't mean that these machines are better than humans at object recognition, because there's many caveats. So the machines that learn by deep learning are often very complicated. They have many parameters and many layers, and it's hard to open the hood and figure out exactly what they are learning. And sometimes that opacity of the machines means that they're actually using features of their input that are very different from the features that humans would use. So here's an example of that. One of my graduate students trained a deep neural network to do the task of recognizing whether an image contains an animal or not. So on the left, you have an example of an animal image. On the right, a landscape photo. And he used a data set of nature photographs. The machine was able to do quite well on this task, but when he dug into exactly what features were being used, it turned out that the neural networks were using the presence of a blurry background to predict that an animal would be present, because in many photographs of animals, the photographer was focusing obviously on the foreground, the animal, so the background was blurry, whereas in no animal pictures, the background is clear. It's a lot easier to determine if a background is blurry than to recognize whether a picture has an animal, but if they correlate very well, then the machine will use whatever particular features allow it to do well on the training set. And this is a common issue in machine learning. Sometimes people call this a shortcut or shortcut learning. It's learning some cue that's not what we intended to have it learn, but the cue allows it to perform well on the task. And this is not just with my students' example, but is common throughout machine learning. One group wanted to know if this ImageNet image recognition challenge was testing machines in a way that would allow them to generalize. So they used a robot with a camera on it to take pictures of household objects in a sort of natural setting, the way that, say, a house cleaning robot might see them, and asked if a vision system is trained on images scraped from the web, like these ImageNet images, would it generalize well on images taken from this very different kind of distribution? And what they found is that if a neural network is trained on web scraped images and tested on the same distribution, web scraped images, the performance is quite high, and these are different neural network architectures. However, if the neural network is trained on web-based images, but tested on images taken by this robot on the same object categories, its performance degrades very significantly. So it's using some kind of features to classify these web-based images that are not generalizable to photos that are taken in this very different kind of method, and even though they're the same object categories. Another group showed that if you take images that are recognized very confidently by a deep neural network, like this fire truck recognized 0.99% confidence, but then you Photoshop the object into different poses, the neural network then changes its categorization, again very confidently, here to a school bus, fireboat, or bobsled. So its behavior is very non-human-like. The kinds of errors it makes are very non-human-like. It's using different kinds of features in its input to make its decisions. This is also shown by a very dramatic study that used a deep reinforcement learning method that was able to learn to play this Atari video game Breakout very well, but then that same game was tested on another version of Breakout where the only change was that the paddle was raised by a few pixels. So in Breakout, you have this paddle that you move horizontally, it hits this ball, which bounces up and destroys bricks. But the deep reinforcement learning system that was able to do well on this task wasn't able to do well on this very, very closely related task. Therefore, it wasn't able to transfer what it had learned here to this task. Whereas any human who had learned to play this game would be able to play it just as well on this version, because there's really no difference except the vertical position of the paddle. So somehow the features that the system's learning here, the cues that it's learning to use to make its decisions, are not the same ones that humans learn. And we've seen this again and again with the vulnerability to adversarial examples, like stickers on stop signs can make a deep neural network vision system classify this as a speed limit 80 sign, and many other examples of such vulnerability shows that the kinds of things that the machine is seeing is very different than what we humans see. So you might want to call this something like learning perceptual categories, which can be quite fragile or brittle, versus robust concepts. And so deep neural networks learn something like perceptual categories rather than what the human brain learns, which we call concepts. So let me just illustrate that with an example. Consider learning the concept of a bridge. So you could train a deep neural network on many different images of bridges, and it probably would learn to recognize new bridges of this kind. But it would be hard to make it generalized to, say, this inverted bridge. It's called a water bridge, where the highway runs under the water, and this bridge is used for boats to cross the highway. Here's a kind of bridge that's very different, but conceptually the same. This is the bodies of ants being used by the colony to bridge a gap so that the colony can move from one surface to another. We talk about bridging our hands, bridge of a nose, the bridge of a song. We humans are able to take perceptual concepts like bridge and to extend them metaphorically to describe analogous situations like a song. And this is very much a really core of human intelligence, is to be able to do this and to recognize new abstract versions of a concept in new situations. We talk about bridging the gender gap. That's a rather abstract notion of bridge, but we understand it very readily. Joe Biden, during his campaign, noted that he was a bridge to a new generation of leaders. And you immediately understand what he means by that, even though it's very different than a sort of a bridge crossing a river. But you can really imagine, say, Joe Biden bridging from one generation to the next with his body, for example. And there's all kinds of other examples of the notion of bridge that's extended in this sort of metaphorical way. We don't even realize it's metaphorical because it's just so much of how we humans use concepts. It's very different from the way that deep neural networks understand the things that they're taught. And my claim is that if we can't get machines to build robust and abstractable concepts the way that humans do, we're not going to be able to get them to be robust and to generalize robustly. Hofstadter, in a very influential paper called Analogy as the Core of Cognition, literally defined a concept as a package of analogies. And you can really see why that is, because of this bridge example. Really shows how analogy is really at the core of forming concepts and making abstractions. So the question is, how can we get machines to learn concepts rather than perceptual categories and to make analogies? So in this talk, I'm going to quickly go over a sort of survey of selected methods for abstraction analogy that people have been looking into, and then talk about some open questions on how to make progress in this area. So deep learning approaches to abstraction have been very popular recently. And one popular domain is what's called Raven's progressive matrices. This is a human IQ test that has been around since the 1930s or something. The idea here is that you have this matrix of figures that are progressing in some way, sort of changing in some structured way, either across the rows or down the columns, and you have to figure out sort of what goes here. And that takes some abstraction. If you look at this for a while, you'll see the answer is number 5. You're given 8, a multiple choice set of answers, 8. And here's another one. Let you look at it for a minute. You could probably see very quickly that the third figure is combining the first 2 figures in each row. And so the answer to this would be number 8. Psychologists have claimed that these problems are highly correlated with human intelligence being able to do well on them. Whether that's true or not, I won't discuss that here, but I'll just say that people have adopted this domain of Raven's progressive matrices as a way to study abstraction in AI systems. In particular, there's been quite a number of deep learning approaches. I'll talk about one of the simpler ones, since I don't have a lot of time, but that was a paper in 2020 in which they basically took the input was the 16 images, the 8, what they called context images here, and then the 8 possible answers, fed that to some kind of deep neural network like a ResNet, and the answer was expressed as a probability distribution over the 8 possible choices. Okay, so you could take the one with highest probability as the system's answer. Now, we humans don't necessarily need a lot of training on this task, but of course, deep neural networks do need a lot of training. And so the authors needed to automatically generate Raven's progressive matrix problems in order to get enough training examples. In fact, they used 42,000 training examples and tested on 14,000 examples. Okay, and the way that they generated these examples was using stochastic image grammar, where you'd, with some probability, choose sort of the general structure of the problem, whether here we're choosing inside, outside, there's something on the outside, there's something on the inside. You choose what the outside component is going to be sort of probabilistically. You say it's going to be in the center, it's going to be a large object. What's on the inside is some number of objects laid out in a grid and so on. And you can be given some set of primitives here and generate any number of problems that you want. So they did that, and they trained their deep neural network, and they found that these ResNet systems, various kinds of them in this thing called Competit, which I won't go into, we're able to do pretty well on these. This average is, these are different kinds of Raven's problems, and this is the average accuracy that the system's got over all the different kinds of problems. And they measured humans' performance on these problems as 84% accuracy, whereas for instance, their ResNet 50 with some pre-training got 86%. Okay, so does that mean that, you know, these systems have a higher IQ than humans? Well, not so fast, because it turns out that there was a significant shortcut that could be taken because of some bias in the way these systems were generated, these problems were generated. The way they generated a problem, the answer was to take the correct answer and to generate the 7 incorrect answers, change one attribute. Okay, so here the shape was changed, here the color, here the color, here the shape, here the size, and so on, but you just change one attribute. And what that means is that you can look at the 8 possible choices and kind of take a majority vote along each dimension. The majority shape is this pentagon. The majority size is large. The majority color is dark, and so on. And that will give you the correct answer because of the way this was generated. And in fact, this is another group discovered this bias and found that if you just train on the answers without the context matrix, you can do as well as the original ResNet. Then they created what they call balanced Raven, which is a new way to generate these answers that supposedly didn't have that shortcut possibility. But it's hard to tell. Some of these shortcuts can be quite subtle, and when you're generating these problems automatically, it produces sometimes some very subtle spurious associations that can produce a high accuracy, but not force the system to actually do the kind of reasoning that we humans are doing. So there's been many, many types of deep learning approaches to these kinds of problems. And I just wanted to show you the kinds of things people are doing. But, you know, this approach seems to me to have some serious limitations. First, because it requires this large corpus of training examples, you need to do this kind of automatic generation, which makes these neural networks susceptible to shortcuts that you, the programmer, are not going to be aware of. It's hard to figure out exactly what these systems learned because they're not very transparent. And more sort of fundamentally, if the goal is general human-like abstraction abilities, it doesn't really make sense to train on tens of thousands of examples. You know, we humans come to these kinds of problems, these abilities to do abstraction, by just living our lives and having, you know, learning the kinds of core concepts that we learn as children and being able to apply those to many different situations. rather than being specifically trained on a particular task, like the Ravens problems. So to me, this approach doesn't really make very much sense if our goal is to have general human-like abstraction abilities. Indeed, the essence of abstraction and analogy is few-shot learning. So another broad approach to this problem of abstraction is called probabilistic program induction. Here, the basic idea is that a concept like this sort of this abstract concept, like a bridge or any of these abstract concepts, is represented as a program, and the task is to find a program that will represent the concept that the system is trying to form. So first you have to define a programming language that the system works in. So that's called a domain-specific language. It's the primitives and grammars for programs that actually learn to generate the data that they get. So it's a generative system. And here's the idea. Say I have an input, like a Ravens problem or something like that. I want to find a program in the domain-specific language that would generate that input, because I want to be able to generate the answer. Okay, so I'm going to search over the space of all programs in my language, and I'm going to find the program that maximizes this probability of the program given the input. Okay, so now we can do that by defining a prior probability over all possible programs. That might be something like programs are more probable if they're short, and a likelihood over possible programs. What is the likelihood of the input given the program? Okay, so then we can do a factoring by Bayes rule and define this search over this likelihood and this prior. So that's a typical kind of Bayesian approach, So you can't really search exhaustively over the space of possible programs, but you can do a sort of more intelligent kind of search. You can sample programs according to this distribution in some more intelligent way until an acceptable one is found. So let me give you an example. This is a work done by Brendan Lake and colleagues called the Omniglot challenge. The idea here is a concept is a handwritten character. Okay, and they have this data set of different handwritten characters from different writing systems. And the data set included the pen strokes that a human made to create the character. This was actually, the paper on this was on the cover of Science. So this was kind of a cool project that really inspired a lot of people. So there's two tasks. One is called one-shot classification. I give you a character like this, and I ask you, here's 20 possibilities. Show me the same character among these 20 possibilities. Well, it's not easy, even for someone like me. This kind of looks like it might be a possibility. This looks like it might be one, but maybe this one looks like the most possible. So you're trying to find the maximum here. And the second task is one-shot generation. I show you a character, and your job is to generate it, to draw it. Okay, so the domain-specific language had a set of primitives, which are these primitive pen strokes. And then the system can learn from analyzing the training data, which are unsupervised, characters that were given to as training data, to build a probability distribution over different ways to create characters. So this character, for example, could be formed by creating this subpart. Each of these has its own subparts. Each of these are formed by primitives. And then to actually generate the character, you can add some motor noise, like your hand might be shaking a little bit while you draw the pen strokes. Okay, so that's the language, and the language is really these probability distributions that are learned from the training data. And then, so this is how you generate something. You sample number of parts, then you sample number of subparts, sample subpart sequence, etc. Some relationships. And these all are defined by probabilities that are learned from training data. And then to generate a token, once you have this program, you add some variance, sample parts, start location, and so on. So this is the concept of a character once you sort of have done this sampling. So the goal here for one-shot classification is to say, okay, let's let IT be the example and IC be these candidates. What you want to do is for each of these candidates, approximate the probability of the candidate given the target. Okay, and then choose the one that has the maximal conditional probability. Well, how do you do that? Well, here's our likelihood and here's our prior. The prior is approximated using some kind of heuristic search like I just talked about to generate a program from the last slide to represent that character. So that's the prior. Then the likelihood is approximated by trying to refit that program representing IC, refit the program representing IT to the program representing IC. So I'm just kind of giving you kind of a general overview. If you're interested in the details, they're all in the paper by Lake et al. But this is a way that we can now search using heuristic search through the possible programs to represent these concepts and try to refit the program to the program representing this concept. One-shot generation is similar. You try to find a program to generate your example character, and then just run that program to generate a new example along with motor noise and so on. And then you can use human judges to compare characters generated by the program with those generated by people under the same one-shot conditions. And here's some of the results that they got. So this is the one-shot classification task. This is the error rate of humans in classification. And here's the error rate of their full program, which they call Bayesian program learning, BPL. These other bars are the BPL with some lesions, and these green, blue bars are deep neural network models that are doing the same kind of one-shot classification. So their system is doing a little bit better than humans even on this one-shot classification task. And on the one-shot generation task, this is the percent of judges who correctly ID'd machines versus humans. So this is kind of a Turing test. You can see that if the judges are doing well, that means the program that generates the character is not doing well, because the judges can tell that it wasn't by a human. So their system is close to 50-50, which means that it's close to fooling 50% of the judges, which is almost passing this Turing test here. They couldn't run these deep learning models on this generation task because these models don't do generation of characters. They only do classification. And they didn't do humans on this. This is judging. They did figure out some human generated characters, and then the judges tried to tell the difference between the machine generated and human generated characters. Sorry. Okay, so these probabilistic program approaches are quite interesting, but they also have some limitations. First of all, they can require a lot of built-in primitives, and you need enough data to learn the prior probabilities and likelihood distributions. that you're going to use when you're searching through the possible programs. And indeed, it can require quite a lot of search. And it's hard to scale this to more complex problems. I mean, people have scaled it to some really interesting problems, but the more complex the problem, the more tractable the search becomes. Yeah, sorry, intractable the search becomes. But there have been some really interesting extensions along the lines of hybrid symbolic and neuro-based systems that incorporate neural networks here to help with this search problem, to try and, similar to the way, like, for instance, AlphaGo worked with a neural network that was trying to work together with Monte Carlo tree search to reduce the amount of search. Okay, the last architecture I want to tell you about is really some old work by myself and Hofstadter on analogy making with the so-called copycat architecture. We looked at a different domain, that is analogies between letter strings. So this requires, this is sort of deceptively simple, these analogy problems only use letters of the alphabet, but they actually can express a lot of interesting abstract concepts. So here the problem is, if string ABC changes to ABD, what's the analogous change to PQRS? And most people will say PQRT. Of course, there's many other possible answers, and there's no right answer, but there are answers that people find more satisfying. But now try this one. ABC changes to ABD. What does PPQQRRSS change to? Well, if you were just being quite literal, you might say PPQQRRST, but that would ignore sort of parsing this into groupings of letters. We can also do things like reversing and filling in blanks, you know, AXXD, ABCD, what do you do here? Okay, and there were thousands and thousands of these problems that were created by humans. And Hofstadter and I built an architecture called Copycat to try and solve these problems. This architecture did not involve learning, but it had a fixed set of concepts that it tried to apply to any new problem that it got. So these are idealized situations, you know, with different kinds of components. And we weren't trying to solve these analogy problems per se, but rather to explore general issues of abstraction and analogy making. And there was a lot of inspiration from neuroscience and psychophysics. So we were inspired by Treisman's work on the temporal dynamics of perception, the sort of shift between very parallel, random, pre-attentive, bottom-up processing, and more deterministic, focused, serial, attentive, top-down processing. The idea that V1 and V2 might be active blackboards, that you have this kind of blackboard that's sustaining different results of computation. And finally, this notion that objects have certain attributes associated with them that was promoted by Kahneman, Treisman, and Gibbs. So let me just show you a little bit about the architecture, and then I'll show you a little demo. So we have a structure called the workspace, sort of the working memory of the system, which has objects in it. Those are the letters. We have a network of concepts that has symbolic concepts like the different letters of the alphabet, the idea of successorship in the alphabet, predecessorship, sameness, identity, opposite, some fairly basic concepts. And then perceptual agents, which take the concepts that are activated in the network, activated by perception down in the workspace, which feeds into the concept network, and then takes those concepts and tries to apply them by building structures. So you could build structures like a sameness group or a successor relationship. So these are data structures that live in the workspace. And these different agents try and build these structures. It's really building a representation of the problem while there's continual interaction between the workspace and the concept network. And we also have what's called a temperature, which measures the this measures the degree of organization, like how good are the structures that have been built so far, and feeds back. So when temperature is high, that means not so much organization. The system is more random. When the system gets more organized, the temperature falls, which makes these perceptual agents more deterministic. So the best way to see this is I'm going to show you a little video of the system running. So you can see this problem, ABC changes to CBA. What does PPQQRR change to? And what you're going to see is these actions of these perceptual agents. That is, like these little lightning bolts are the agents considering different kinds of relationships and building them if they seem strong. And the darker the line, the stronger the structure. That is, the more the system has decided that structure is a good one. And I'm not showing the concept network here, but it's different concepts are getting activated, like sameness, which then brings in top-down pressure to see, for instance, the lower string in terms of sameness groups. And you can see the program very quickly it starts out quite randomly, but then very quickly starts to get more deterministic and kind of freezing in, if you will, as the temperature gets lower on a particular way of perceiving this, and is able to get an answer here, saying reverse direction of the string, reverse direction of the group. Okay, so let me go on to the next slide. Okay. So actually I think I told you all these different aspects of the program, but I won't go into these because I'm running out of time. But of course, this program also has a number of limitations. Its architecture is somewhat ad hoc. It's not clear how general it is, and its concepts are fixed. Its concepts like successorship, predecessorship are not learned. It's an architecture that can apply its concepts to any new situation it gets, but doesn't learn new concepts. There's also been some really interesting work lately by Francois Cholet on a new benchmark for thinking about analogy and abstraction, using the ideas from Elizabeth Spelke about what core knowledge we humans have innately about objects, space, numbers, and so on. And these kinds of he calls them the ARC, or abstraction and reasoning corpus, where you have kind of like copycat demonstration. This grid changes to this grid, but you have more examples here. This grid changes to this grid changes to this grid. How do we now change this grid? You have to generate an answer. And Cholet, you can look at these online. They're really quite a beautiful set of little challenge puzzles in analogy. There's 400 tasks, as he calls them, in the training set, and then there's a hidden evaluation set of 600 more that's tested on. So this is all about few-shot learning. And this was put up as a Kaggle challenge. You can go to Kaggle and look at this and see how other people's programs on it have worked. The best programs are getting about 30% of the test cases solved, given 3 guesses, which is what is allowed. But none of them are very general. So I would say this challenge is still pretty much unsolved. So how do we make progress in this area? Well, I think rather than everybody using their own domain or different domains for different projects, we need some kind of common suite of challenging tasks. And I like these idealized domains because we can be very explicit about what prior knowledge and assumptions are needed. And by avoiding language-based tasks, we can avoid sort of anthropomorphizing what a system has achieved. If a system can communicate with us in language, we can be fooled, like with these language models or chatbots. We can be fooled into how much it actually understands. Evaluation should not just be on accuracy, which is what most people have done in the past, but it should also be on generality and robustness, that is, performance against different tasks. I think ability to generate as opposed to simply recognize solutions. You could see that some of these tasks I talked about were generative, some gave a multiple choice, so it was just about recognition. And also few-shot learning, ability to do this kind of abstraction with only a few examples. And also robustness to modification in the tasks. So I think this kind of evaluation, which most people have not done so far, is really important in us assessing the actual abstraction and reasoning ability of these kinds of systems. And finally, scalability to more complex examples of tasks. All right, well, thank you for listening. If you're interested in more discussion about this kind of thing, I talk a lot about it in my book called Artificial Intelligence, A Guide for Thinking Humans. Thank you very much.